Chapter 49. The lights in the living room were not very bright, and the entrance was not illuminated, creating a slightly dim atmosphere that made the mood between the two a bit eerie. Leonardo didn't like overly bright things. When he was alone at home, he would always turn the lights to the dimmest setting. It used to be because he disliked brightness, but now he believed that Eloise was his only light. Yet at this very moment, his source of light was dangerously testing the limits of his tolerance. The emotions in Leonardo's eyes surged relentlessly, and beneath his slightly gloomy expression lurked a madness that even he could hardly imagine. The violence and irritability within him constantly pounded against the cage of reason. Leonardo knew that the beast inside his heart was beginning to lose control again. His arms tightened around the woman, and Eloise sensed the change in his mood at once, but instead of comforting him as she usually did, she continued to push against the man's limits. The woman turned her head slightly, and her indifferent voice echoed in the entrance. "What if I really went to find someone else?" Bang! The walls of reason crumbled abruptly, and before Eloise could react, the world spun before her eyes as she was lifted up by the man. Without giving her any chance to resist, the man carried Eloise directly to the living room and threw her onto the couch. His movements were fluid and swift, to the point that even Eloise couldn't help but feel a bit amazed. She should have felt panic and fear at this moment, but for some reason, looking at Leonardo's gloomy expression and tightly drawn lips, she felt a hidden sense of anticipation. As expected, the man covered her completely, his hands braced on either side of Eloise, trapping the woman in his embrace. There was an innate difference in size between men and women. Eloise didn't look small, but when pressed beneath Leonardo, she appeared exceptionally petite. "What do you mean?" the man asked, his expression icy. His gaze bore into the woman before him, the intensity of his stare almost burning Eloise to ashes. The woman met his eyes without fear, looking into his startlingly bright pupils, hiding her quiet amazement beneath an expression of calm. Eloise realized that this might be the first time she had ever looked so closely into his eyes, felt his emotions. Yes, she had misunderstood. Leonardo was never a poor, weak little cat or a boyfriend without bite. Compared to those harmless animals, Leonardo was more like a black panther lurking in the darkness, elegant and calm as he paced during the day, but once he found his prey, he began to lie in wait, delivering a fatal strike under the cover of night and when least expected. Eloise felt that she had indeed been deceived. Now, she had become the target in the man's eyes with no chance of escape. If seen by others, being targeted by such a predator might incite fear, panic, leading to struggle and resistance, until finally surrendering. But Eloise was never such a person. From the beginning, she was the one in control. Although initially deceived by his appearance, upon discovering the truth, she decisively refused to repeat the same mistake. Moreover, compared to a docile pet that only obeys, she seemed to prefer someone like Leonardo, a beast full of wildness. It was too irresistible. Truly in need of discipline, I said. Eloise spoke, her hand gently hooking around the man's neck, lifting her chin slightly, and whispering in his ear with a voice tinged with temptation, "What if I've set my sights on another little boyfriend?" As soon as the words fell, the man's pupils contracted. The next moment, his hand supporting himself on the sofa seized the woman's shoulder, pressing her against the couch, his hot kiss sealing the mouth that relentlessly challenged his reason, stealing her breath. A sharp pain came from her lips, and Eloise was slightly startled, her eyes darkening, her arms around his neck tightening as she turned from being passive to proactive in an instant. This kiss was far too fiery, unlike the tenderness of every previous kiss. This time, it was more like a war between the two, neither wanting to concede, making it more intense than ever before. Their lips and teeth intertwined, the sound of saliva echoing in the vast living room, the once cold apartment warmed by Eloise's presence, made feverish by this passionate kiss. After an unknown period, their positions had changed without them realizing it. Leonardo sat on the sofa, and Eloise was straddling his lap, slightly lowering her head. The man lifted his chin, his exquisite jawline incredibly alluring, the occasional rolling of his Adam's apple full of temptation. His jacket was discarded on the floor, and the woman's shirt had been unintentionally tugged open by several buttons during their struggle, the hot palm against the cool skin, like a beast seeking treasure, exploring deeper, finally reaching the clasps. Leonardo dared not be reckless, all his actions laced with seduction. Eloise opened her eyes, looking at the man's slightly aroused face, a crafty glint flashing in her eyes. She hadn't forgotten his words in the recording. Retreating to advance, this was his usual tactic. Suddenly, the woman released the man's lips, and Leonardo, who was caught in the throes of passion, hadn't reacted for a moment, instinctively chasing after Eloise's lips, only to be stopped midway by a finger from the woman. Leonardo opened his eyes, meeting the playful gaze of Eloise, and he immediately understood. She was teasing him. The unbearable sensation from deep within his body left him with no time to think about it now, his fingers wandering at the clasps, tentatively undoing one. But the next moment, a sharp pain came from the back of his head. The woman grabbed his hair, the amusement in her eyes tinged with a hint of threat, as if saying, "Try undoing another one?" The man pursed his lips, the deepest desires within him making him restless, but Eloise wouldn't allow it. He wanted it, yet he didn't dare, feeling a bit aggrieved. With a tight grip, Leonardo buried his head in the woman's collarbone, the buttons pulled open, revealing a large expanse of snow-white skin, contrasting sharply with the black bra straps, a potent visual impact that made Leonardo unable to resist kissing it several times, as if this could alleviate some of the desire in his heart. "Eloise, you said you were mine." Leonardo spoke, his tone carrying a hint of hidden dominance. Eloise raised an eyebrow, not denying his words. Her collarbone felt itchy, the man's kisses landing in quick succession, stirring a similar itch in her heart. "And now everyone knows you're mine," Leonardo said, his hot breath spraying on her skin, making her feel a bit hot as well. A trace of confusion flashed in her eyes. Eloise didn't immediately understand what he was referring to, and Leonardo, as if sensing Eloise's confusion, explained, "The photo, that photo." Eloise understood. He was talking about the photo taken in secret and posted on X. "Although you can't see the faces clearly, as long as I can stand beside you," the man said, his arms tightening around Eloise, his tone carrying a hint of desolation and caution. Eloise's mind immediately conjured up a scene. The way Leonardo spoke now, it was as if he were the virtuous consort in an ancient harem, with a virtuous character, seemingly gentle and considerate, understanding of others, but every word and sentence was laced with hidden meanings, pulling the emperor's heartstrings with a mix of pity and affection. "Oh," Eloise said, her amusement not diminishing, not jealous. The man's body stiffened slightly, his thin lips landing again on the woman's butterfly bones, his movements gentle yet urgent. "What good would jealousy do?" Leonardo said, actually lightly biting the bra strap with his teeth, then tentatively tugging it with his mouth. After a moment, it popped back onto Eloise's shoulder. Extremely bold and provocative actions, full of aggressiveness in the body, but the tone of voice remained so weak. "You're busy with work, so how could I bother you over such a small matter?" Hiss. Eloise narrowed her eyes, a smirk appearing at the corners of her mouth when the man wasn't looking, her heart beginning to sway. What an angel. Too obedient, isn't it? If she hadn't heard that recording, she might have really thought so. Bending down to kiss the man's hair gently, Eloise softly said, "Be good, keep it up." As soon as the words fell, before Leonardo could react, the woman stood up directly. The warmth in his arms vanished instantly, and Leonardo looked blankly at the woman before him. She put the bra strap back to its original position in front of him, but didn't button up her shirt, generously displaying the beautiful scenery of her chest. Leonardo sat on the sofa, a young man controlled by his desires, totally without self-control in front of Eloise, and was now suffering greatly. He couldn't restrain himself, but Eloise just glanced down casually, then lifted the man's chin with her hand, saying, Get some sleep early, okay? After saying that, the woman turned to leave, and Leonardo finally reacted, grabbing Eloise's hand and looking at her with watery eyes, saying, "Won't you help me?" "Honey, I'm uncomfortable." The man's cheeks were tinged with a slight flush, even the corners of his eyes red, his eyes veiled with a layer of mist, like a juicy peach, imagining how delicious it would be to take a bite. Eloise's gaze darkened, her throat tightened, but she wasn't swayed by the man's appearance. "It's good to be young and vigorous, but it should be done in moderation, right?" It made sense, but Leonardo was now at the edge of what he could endure. The cold and dignified image of the day had completely vanished under the poison named Eloise. At this point, desire dominated reason, leaving him to act instinctively according to his heart. The man held Eloise's hand against his cheek, and then eagerly rubbed it a couple of times, his voice hoarse as he spoke again. "I'm really uncomfortable." After saying that, he kissed Eloise's palm. "Help me with this." Eloise's eyebrows raised slightly, unable to help but think in her heart, "This little boyfriend is quite imaginative, isn't he?" The next moment, Eloise yanked her hand back forcefully, smiling at the bewildered Leonardo and saying, "Be good, take care of yourself." In the living room, the man sat on the sofa, his desire in full bloom, watching the woman's heartless departure, his body tense, his expression turning inexpressibly dark. The next day, in the president's office, Eloise was at work while Luke stood before the desk, reporting today's itinerary. Afterward, Luke seemed to remember something and said, "Eloise, according to the news from below, Leonardo the assistant has sold those 2 properties." Upon hearing this, Eloise's hand holding the pen paused slightly, and a hint of dark light flashed in her eyes. Recalling the night before, when she turned to return to the bedroom and met the man's extremely ugly expression, she couldn't help but chuckle. She then said, "I see. There's no need to further track his affairs in the future." It was clear that Leonardo was more complex than she had imagined, not a simple person at all. To sell those 2 properties was a decision he had made, and it would be inappropriate to pursue it further. Hearing this, Luke paused slightly and didn't dare to ask more, nodding in agreement. Just as he prepared to leave, his steps suddenly halted, and a hint of indecision flashed across his face. He then spoke up, "Eloise, I feel that Assistant Jiang is a bit different from what we had imagined." With that, Eloise looked up slightly, meeting Luke's expression of wanting to speak but hesitating. Her eyes held a smile, and her tone, when she spoke again, was not as puzzled as Luke had imagined. Instead, she said very calmly, "I know." Luke thought that Eloise didn't believe him, and he wanted to describe the scene from a few days ago when Leonardo confronted Ronnie. But upon careful thought, he felt that this didn't prove anything. After all, it was just a feeling he had at that moment, a sense that Leonardo was much more terrifying than he had imagined. After pondering for a few seconds, Luke decided not to say more. Just as he was about to turn to leave, Eloise suddenly said, "Prepare for the job transfer." Luke froze on the spot. "Job transfer? Whose job transfer?" "In a couple of days, I will go directly to the headquarters for my new position, and you'll come with me," Eloise said, with an unquestionable tone. Luke was even more confused now. So, he was getting a promotion along with Eloise. Job transfers were not simple, especially for someone in Eloise's position. In the following time, Luke and Eloise were busy with work handover. All remaining affairs would be fully handled by Ronnie before the headquarters sent someone down. Because of this, there were many matters that needed to be handed over, and since Ronnie had not been in the company for long and was not familiar with some aspects, Eloise and Ronnie started to meet more and more frequently. About Eloise's promotion to vice president at the headquarters, Leonardo was naturally aware. But even so, watching Eloise's increasingly busy figure, the man couldn't help but feel uneasy. Although they lived in the same apartment, their time together was actually quite scarce due to Eloise's busy schedule. After waking up in the morning and rushing to the company, Eloise would enter the study to work again after dinner back in the apartment, sometimes not even coming home for dinner. Leonardo could understand that managing even a fraction of the QS Corporation's industries was not easy. Just a single branch had many projects, including those currently underway, those being planned for, and those to be initiated in the future. To complete the handover in a short time, a great deal of time and energy was required. He knew he shouldn't have any emotions about this, and seeing Eloise busy with company affairs, he felt heartache. But the sudden coldness made him restless. Most importantly, Ronnie, the vice president of the branch, had started to have increasingly frequent interactions with Eloise due to work handover. From initial video conferences in the study to later meetings over meals outside, Leonardo was seething with anger. Although Eloise always explained the reasons for their meetings in advance, the jealousy in his heart did not diminish at all. At home, he could find various reasons to stay in Eloise's study, monitoring whether Ronnie discussed anything beyond work, but once they met outside, he could only fume at home alone. His possessive jealousy made him not want Eloise to have any contact with Ronnie, but his reason told him he had to pretend to be generous. They were only in contact because of work. What right did he have to be angry? After pretending to be a good boy in front of Eloise for so long, how could he break the facade all at once? Half a month later, Eloise finally transferred to the headquarters and successfully took up the position of vice president. Thinking the hard times had finally passed, Leonardo hurried to the supermarket after work that evening, bought a lot of Eloise's favorite dishes, and while checking out at the register, he also picked up 2 boxes of condoms, planning for a long overdue intimate evening. That night, after dinner, Leonardo went to the room, thoroughly cleansed himself inside and out, and made sure he was fragrant from head to toe, including a certain part, before he planned to find Eloise to relieve the loneliness that had been building up. However, to his surprise, Eloise wasn't in the room. She was working in the study again. The man's face darkened as he stood at the doorway of the study, staring straight at the woman working at the desk, his mood becoming extremely complicated. Why had Eloise suddenly become such a workaholic? Back in the days when they had just met, she would occasionally come to the bar to tease him, and even at 4 in the morning, she would wait by the back door of the bar or pick him up on the streets late at night. Why was it that back then, as the company's president, she had so much free time, and now that he was right in front of her, her eyes were only on the documents, not even glancing at him? The sense of novelty was truly magical. When it was hot, it could stir up all emotions, no matter what difficulties and inconveniences there were. But just because of this enthusiasm, one's thoughts would always be on the other person. However, once the novelty wore off, all emotions would be like stagnant water. No matter how much others tried to stir it, there would be no big waves. Leonardo thought of this and his heart gradually cooled. Was she no longer interested in him? On the other side, Eloise, who was reading the documents, had no idea that her little boyfriend was wildly overthinking. She had just transferred to the headquarters, and although the affairs under her were not many, she needed to spend a lot of time adapting to the new environment. Furthermore, since her transfer to the headquarters, those old-timers in the company had been watching her even more closely. However, Eloise's father had given her a major project that the company was running, disregarding everyone's objections. Now she had to adapt to the company's pace as soon as possible. Otherwise, if she was criticized at the board meeting, not only would she be embarrassed, but so would her father. Perhaps the man's gaze was too intense, making Eloise feel something was off. When she looked up and met Leonardo's somewhat aggrieved eyes, she couldn't help but laugh. "What are you doing standing there?" "Becoming a door god," Eloise said, putting down the pen in her hand. Leonardo hadn't quite reacted yet, still lost in his self-doubt about whether Eloise was no longer interested in him, until he met the woman's teasing gaze, and only then did he snap back to reality, suppressing his messy emotions. Drooping his eyes, the man's expression changed from initial resentment to a few moments of restrained sadness and desolation. "It's nothing, you should keep working," the man said, pretending to turn to leave. Seeing his deliberately slow movements, Eloise understood immediately, and the smile in her eyes deepened as she said, "Come here." As soon as the words fell, the man stopped his steps and walked towards Eloise. As soon as Leonardo reached Eloise's side, the woman sitting in the office chair reached out and grabbed the man's wrist, pulling it towards her. She lightly sniffed the inside of the man's arm and said, "You smell so good. Have you showered?" The woman's tone was very calm, as if stating an ordinary fact, but it made Leonardo's face flush, and his ears couldn't help but start to heat up. The shame in his heart wanted him to pull back his hand, but the subconscious in his heart wanted her to do more of such things. Kiss him, hug him, and smell the scent of other parts of his body. "Am I disturbing you?" Leonardo said. In the light, the man seemed exceptionally gentle, with his hair draped over his forehead, and even his expression and tone were tinged with a bit of caution. Eloise met Leonardo's gaze, but didn't miss the glimmer of darkness in his eyes. Raising her eyebrows slightly, she couldn't help but laugh, holding back the urge to expose him, and said with a smile, "What if I say yes?" The woman's answer was a bit different from what he had imagined, and Leonardo's expression stiffened, the facade of his vulnerability beginning to crack. But Leonardo was also an old fox, and he quickly recovered his original demeanor, pretending to pull his hand back. Leonardo knew that Eloise liked to tease him, and at this moment, he could not lose his composure. However, the development of the events again deviated from his expectations. Instead of pretending, Eloise actually let go of his hand. For a moment, the man's arm froze in midair, unable to advance or retreat. The White Lotus was a bit unable to hold on, but he still endured it with strong self-control. The expression on his face became increasingly bitter, and his voice was filled with deep sorrow. "I'm sorry, I'll leave now." With a speed of 0.5 meter per second, Leonardo slowly walked out of the study, but the woman behind him still didn't call him back. "Should I close the door for you?" The man, who had stepped out the door, turned back and asked. "Whatever you like." At this moment, the man's disguise was already somewhat patchy, his stiff mouth, and his body that seemed to want to re-enter the room, all indicating his intentions. "Okay, I'll close the door for you." There was a hint of teeth-gritting meaning in his voice, and this time the man did not hesitate, quickly closing the door with a bang, like a child who didn't get candy, secretly having a little tantrum. Eloise looked at the tightly closed door, and after a while, she turned her gaze back to the documents, but she had lost the desire to continue working. She glanced at the phone screen from time to time, silently counting the time in her heart. Sure enough, 15 minutes later, the study door opened again. The man, without a word, brought in a cup of OJ. As if afraid of being rejected by the woman, he spoke first. "Working is hard. Have a cup of OJ and take a break." Chapter 50. In the quiet study, an empty glass rested within arm's reach. A man sat beside a woman, sprawled across the desk, lost in slumber. Eloise set down her pen and removed her gold-rimmed glasses from the bridge of her nose before turning to look at Leonardo, who was already deep in sleep. The man's sleeping form always looked so endearing, his soft bangs draped over his forehead, half of his face concealed in the crook of his arm, and his delicate facial features seemed to glow softly under the light, emanating an indescribable warmth. He wasn't old to begin with, but his usual aloof and dignified expressions, along with his deep gaze, often caused people to unconsciously overlook his age. There was still a trace of milk at the corner of his lips, remnants from when he had just drunk it. Eloise didn't like milk, and in the end, it found its way into Leonardo's stomach. She knew his little schemes, so when he entered the study for the second time, she didn't tease him further. After all, occasional playfulness was charming, but she didn't want to accidentally go too far, as it would be her who had to console him. The man had dragged a chair to sit beside her, claiming he wanted to accompany her in her work and would jointly explore any areas he didn't understand. Of course, it was an excuse from Leonardo, and Eloise didn't take it seriously, allowing him to sit beside her as she immersed herself in her work. To her surprise, some people claimed they wanted to accompany her, yet ended up falling asleep themselves. It was already past 10 o'clock, and the quiet study was filled with the man's steady breathing, light but somehow warming Eloise's heart. She gently brushed the man's hair with her hand, and he seemed to find it ticklish, furrowed his brows, and then continued to sleep. Eloise knew that she had indeed neglected him these past days. Her work was busy, and she also harbored the intention to test him. She wanted to see how long he could endure. Now it seemed that her little boyfriend was indeed well-behaved, whether by nature or pretense. At least at that moment, he didn't act out on impulse. Eloise knew how much Leonardo disliked Ronnie and was aware of how frantic he must have felt knowing about her interactions with Ronnie these days. Yet, in reality, Leonardo was much more patient than she had imagined. Although he would occasionally do little things to express his uneasiness, he never threw a tantrum over it. Even when he knew she was going out to dinner with Ronnie, he only reminded her to come home early. Thinking of this, Eloise's expression softened. Leaning down slightly, Eloise couldn't resist kissing Leonardo on the cheek. The next moment, just as she was about to stand up, her wrist resting on the desk suddenly tightened. Eloise raised an eyebrow, watching as the man's eyelashes fluttered, though he didn't open his eyes. Clearly, the man should have been awake. Pretending to sleep? Her lips pressed against the man's ear, the woman's voice filled with teasing, causing the man's ears to redden instantly. Gradually, the man opened his eyes, meeting Eloise's gaze filled with amusement. "Just woke up," Leonardo said, his eyes still somewhat dazed. He had indeed just woken up at the moment Eloise kissed him. Perhaps because he was still a bit drowsy, the man was soft all over, and his emotions became more delicate than usual. His grip on the woman's wrist didn't loosen, and his tone when he spoke had an unexpected hint of coquetry. "Kiss me again," the man said, staring straight at Eloise, his eyes still misty, utterly adorable, and it directly struck Eloise's heart. Regardless of whether it was an act or not, what couldn't be denied was that Eloise was truly moved by him at this moment. She chuckled, and Eloise leaned down to kiss him again, this time on his lips. The kiss wasn't tinged with any desire, more like a reward for a well-behaved child, brief and fleeting. "How about this?" Eloise said. The man pursed his lips, his gaze lowered, looking calm, but the increasingly tight grip on the woman's hand and the trembling eyelashes all revealed his joy and excitement at the moment. After a few seconds, the man spoke again. "Not enough." The answer was expected, and this time the woman lingered on his lips for a few seconds, nibbling on his lower lip before leaving. "How about this?" The next moment, with a bang, the man abruptly stood up from the chair, lifting the woman into his arms. The documents originally on the desk were swept aside by the man's somewhat rough action, and Eloise was forced to sit on the desk. The man who had been acting all cute just a second ago seemed to have transformed into someone else, like a wild beast suddenly awakened, brimming with wildness in an instant. Leonardo's body pressed forward entirely, and Eloise could only instinctively wrap her arms around the man's neck, leaning back slightly, enduring his advances. "Not enough," Leonardo said, lowering his head to press against the woman's forehead, their noses touching, and their lips brushed against each other as they spoke. "Students like this will fail," the man said, his tone suddenly turning dangerously. Eloise's lips curved, continuing the act with the man. Then, "Teacher, do you want to teach me how?" The woman's eyes sparkled, and despite being in a vulnerable position, the elegance and nobility she exuded from her bones kept her in a dominant position in this confrontation. She was beautiful, so beautiful that she often aroused the deepest conquest in men, wanting to madly possess her, wanting her body and soul to be dependent on him, wondering what she would look like when she cried. The atmosphere in the study became extremely amorous. This was supposed to be a place for work, but now it added a sense of excitement to their intimacy. "Then you'd better learn well." The rest of the sentence was swallowed up by their lips. This kiss was much more passionate than the previous two, not fierce, but incredibly lingering. The man teased attentively, sweeping gently over the woman's tongue with utmost tenderness, drawing her into a shared descent. Eloise watched him seriously kissing, a hint of amusement flashing in her eyes. These were all things she had taught him, and now the man had learned them perfectly and used them back on her. Leonardo was intelligent. No matter what he did, he could learn by analogy and apply what he learned in various situations, even when it came to such matters. After a few seconds, Eloise closed her eyes, savoring the gentleness of the other, and their entwined lips silently made the study feel a bit sultry. The cool scent from the man's body invaded Eloise's nose, her favorite scent. She remembered she once had a boyfriend who liked to dress up flamboyantly and would always spray cologne on himself before going out. The smell wasn't unpleasant, but she wasn't the least bit interested. What couldn't be denied was that the scent on Leonardo was her favorite. It made her feel both at ease and restless, itching her heart. Their kiss gradually grew, the man's grip on the woman's waist tightening, their bodies intimately close, as if feeling the heat radiating from each other. It was unclear how much time had passed, but the kiss finally ended. When they parted, the man's breathing had become much more rapid, and his body, fresh from a shower, started to perspire slightly. The man rested his head on the woman's shoulder, as if thinking that by doing so, his physical changes wouldn't be noticed. It was him who had said he wanted to teach, yet he was the first to succumb. "Don't I get a reward for being so good these days?" "What reward do you want?" Eloise said, her back suddenly feeling a heat, the man's restless hands at work. After returning to the apartment, Eloise had changed into a set of casual clothes, the loose top intended for comfort, but now it gave the man an opportunity. "I want." Eloise's eyes flickered, knowing what the man was referring to. Leaning close to the man's ear, Eloise spoke softly again, "In my room." But Leonardo didn't move at this, holding the woman tighter, as if silently pleading. Eloise immediately understood, raising an eyebrow, her tone tinged with amusement. "Want to do it here?" The man trembled all over, and after a while, a soft, came from where the woman's shoulder was. Eloise was a bit surprised. This little boyfriend had quite the ambition. "Aren't the condoms in the room?" Eloise asked. In the next instant, the man released his grip on the woman's waist, took out something he had prepared from his pajama pants pocket, then lowered his head to bite one corner and quickly removed the clothes on his body, tossing them onto the desk. The man's muscular body suddenly appeared before Eloise, her eyes lighting up slightly, watching as he held a condom in his mouth, and couldn't help but chuckle. "When did you buy this?" It was clear that this condom wasn't the one she had previously asked the housekeeper to buy. After the last battle, although many of the strawberry-flavored condoms were used, there were still some left, so there was no need to buy more. But to her surprise, the man had secretly stockpiled them. "After work," the man said, his voice a bit muffled due to holding the item, but his sexiness was still evident. His movements were a bit hasty, his entire being already in an extremely excited state. The moment he touched her skin, the warmth of his palm made her tremble involuntarily. The man held Eloise, bringing his face closer, staring directly at the woman, his eyes bright to the point of being startling. "Help me put it on, okay?" Eloise's eyes darkened, and the next moment, she slowly reached out to take the item from the man's mouth, holding it right in front of his eyes, her lips curving as she said, "Then lift up for me." Almost as soon as her words fell, Leonardo grabbed the woman's wrist, pressing down on her with extreme aggression, his lips against the woman's ear, speaking in a bewitching voice. It was already lifted long ago. Over half a month had passed since then, and Eloise sat in her room while Leonardo stood beside her, his face slightly cold as he helped her pack her luggage. Eloise sat on a chair by the dressing table, her arms crossed as she watched him. The man's expression was not exactly bad, but the tight corners of his mouth and slightly furrowed brow all indicated that he was in a rather unpleasant mood. With a slap, the man roughly threw her clothes into the suitcase. Eloise raised an eyebrow upon seeing this and couldn't help but speak up. "That dress is a custom order from the C brand. While money is not an issue, it won't be easy to buy if it gets damaged." As soon as her words fell, the man's hand paused slightly, and he instinctively softened his movements as he squatted down to fold the clothes. She had a last-minute business trip scheduled for that afternoon. There were some problems at the H-City branch that required her to personally go and review, with an uncertain duration that would most likely take around 3 days. The trip itself was sudden. Even the plane ticket was booked by Luke half an hour ago. Everything was so unexpected. Eloise received the notice and rushed back to the apartment to pack her luggage. She had planned to explain the situation to Leonardo on the way, but she didn't expect to bump into Leonardo coming out of the room as soon as she returned to the apartment. The other party seemed equally surprised, frozen in place for a moment before slowly explaining that he had taken a day off, then asked her what had happened. Eloise didn't suspect anything and told him about her afternoon business trip. Upon hearing this, Leonardo turned into the current state, not knowing what he was angry about. "Maybe I should pack my own things," Eloise said, pretending to stand up from the chair, but Leonardo tensed his expression and said, "No need, you still have to catch a plane, I'll do it." It was the man who offered to help her pack her luggage, and Eloise naturally welcomed it, watching him busy himself from the chair. To be honest, Leonardo really had the potential to be a good husband and father. He packed her luggage in an orderly fashion, even neater than when she packed for her own trips, and he was meticulous, preparing everything she needed without any room for her to be picky. After lunch, Eloise stood at the entryway. Just as she finished putting on her shoes and was about to leave, her wrist suddenly tightened. Before she could react, the man enveloped her from behind, holding her tightly in his arms. Her shoulder sank, and the next moment, her neck felt itchy with the touch of the man's kisses. Eloise's hand holding the suitcase handle tightened slightly, and she chuckled, "So clingy." Ignoring the woman's teasing words, Leonardo tightened his arms around her and spoke with a heavy sense of reluctance in his voice. "I think I forgot to pack something for you." "What?" Eloise asked, and the man was silent for a few seconds before speaking in a voice filled with temptation. "Take me with you, okay?" She was slightly startled, and the next moment, Eloise let go of the handle, turned around, and cupped the man's face, the smile in her eyes growing stronger. "Acting like a child?" Leonardo's eyes darkened, and his mouth curved downward slightly. A few seconds later, the man lowered his gaze, covered the woman's hand with his own, and nuzzled against her palm like a dependent, suddenly mentioning another topic. "The medicine is almost finished. Will you accompany me to get more when you come back?" Eloise paused, her smile fading slightly. Looking at the man's dim expression, she couldn't tell if it was his pretense or genuine emotion. "All right," Eloise said. As soon as her words fell, Eloise's eyes flashed with cunning, and she tiptoed, pressing her lips to the man's collarbone, sucking hard. A sharp pain followed, and before the man could react, Eloise withdrew her actions, gently stroking the mark she had just left. It was her lipstick, but soon a fresh strawberry mark would appear. "Behave at home, okay?" Eloise said, her tone unconsciously filled with indulgence. "I'll be back when the mark fades." Leonardo was slightly startled, feeling a bit torn, unsure whether to wish for the mark to fade quickly or slowly. They lingered at the door for 10 minutes, and Luke and the driver were already waiting downstairs, so Eloise finally left the apartment with her suitcase. Almost as soon as the door closed, the atmosphere around the man returned to his usual indifference. Despite still having that aloof face, his slightly dulled pupils exuded an eerie coldness. 2 minutes later, the man took out his phone from his pocket and dialed a number without any expression on his face. "Book the next available flight to M City." The opulent casino was bustling with people coming and going, and despite it being late at night, the place was lively, as if darkness was their natural habitat. This was the largest casino in M City, with a golden and splendid appearance that exuded luxury. The pink and purple lighting combined with glass decorations created a dreamy atmosphere in the vast space, which indeed fit the mood. Indeed, this was a place for dreams, where the poor could become wealthy overnight and the rich could end up destitute. With every step, one's life could change dramatically. However, those who gambled here were mostly affluent. The person passing you by could very well be a wealthy businessman from a certain district or the president of a company. There were all sorts of people here, most of whom liked to come with a companion. It was common for men to bring a female partner, which eventually became a way to compare, as the more beautiful the partner, the more prestige the man enjoyed. The atmosphere in the casino was not chaotic. Unlike those illegal places, everything here was orderly. In this city, gambling was an industry, and it had even become a symbol of culture. Mr. Zhao was in good spirits today, and the person who gambled with him earlier had already lost and left the scene. Just as he was about to pack up and leave as well, a shadow suddenly fell in front of him, and the next moment, an unfamiliar face appeared before him. It was a very young face, with a cold expression that exuded a sense of danger. The deep, unfathomable pupils sent a chill down one's spine when glanced at, causing one to shiver. "Mr. Zhao, how about a round?" Before Mr. Zhao could react, the young man suddenly curved his lips into a smile, as if teasing, but his eyes held no amusement, only a hint of provocation. This youngster was indeed bold, piquing Mr. Zhao's interest. He took out his cigar case from his pocket, and his desire to leave dissipated immediately. "What are we betting on?" "Baccarat." As soon as the words left his mouth, Mr. Zhao paused in lighting his cigar, looking at the young man and raising an eyebrow, an old hand. "Are you sure you want to play this with me?" Mr. Zhao had been in the gambling world for many years and had seen his fair share of hot-blooded youngsters, all of whom were taught a lesson by him in the end. After all, the waters in this business were deep, far beyond the understanding of kids who hadn't even grown up yet. "Mr. Zhao, are you afraid?" Upon hearing this, Mr. Zhao burst into laughter, shaking the cigar in his hand and saying, "Do you even have the means to gamble with me?" The young man's smile remained unchanged, pushing the stack of chips in front of Mr. Zhao calmly. After glancing at them, Mr. Zhao's interest grew beyond measure. "2 million right off the bat, you're quite aggressive, aren't you? Aren't you afraid of losing everything, even your pants?" As soon as the words fell, the group of people following Mr. Zhao erupted into a contemptuous laughter. "Mr. Zhao can try." Mr. Zhao's eyes darkened, then his mouth curved into a grin. "All right, then let's show you what's what." A bet involving millions was not uncommon in this casino, and it seemed that no one around paid much attention to this situation. Everything began silently. The atmosphere on the gambling table shifted rapidly, and after half an hour, Mr. Zhao's face showed an increasingly excited expression. Looking at the man in front of him, the mocking intent became more intense. "Oh, still gambling? You've already lost 10 million. Mr. Zhao said, lighting his second cigar of the day. "Light gambling is fun, but heavy gambling is damaging. I understand that young people just don't like to lose, but reality is always cruel, isn't it?" However, the man across from him maintained his unemotional expression, and the corner of his mouth curved even more, a glimmer of obscure light flashing in his eyes. "Does Mr. Zhao dare to go big?" "Oh, still going big?" Mr. Zhao said. "If Mr. Zhao wins next round, I'll personally transfer you 100 million. As soon as these words were spoken, the air around seemed to freeze for a moment, and Mr. Zhao on the chair also stiffened for a second. Slowly he curbed his expression, looking at the man in front of him, his scrutiny growing deeper. "I can't afford that much money. What do you want?" In the next second, the man spoke lightly. "I want the 5% of the shares you have in QS Corporation." Mr. Zhao froze for a second, quickly realizing that the man came prepared. Betting 100 million for 5% of the shares, this kid really had guts. He clearly knew this was the other party's scheme, but in front of everyone, the man naturally had no chance of cheating, and he could guarantee with his years of gambling experience that in the upcoming gamble, he had an 80% chance of winning. To gamble or not to gamble? 3 minutes later, Mr. Zhao's eyes darkened and he said, "Write it down. In case you renege, I'll have a hard time." The man's eyes flashed with a dark light. Then he said, "Of course." 10 minutes later, the man walked out of the casino, his expression as cold and indifferent as ever, his unfathomable eyes making it impossible to guess whether he was a winner or a loser in that grand gamble. The ringtone suddenly sounded, and the man took out his phone from his pocket, Looking at the name displayed on the screen, the coldness on his face instantly dissipated, and his features softened considerably. "I'm back at the hotel. Have you been good at the apartment?" The familiar female voice came from the other end of the phone. The man stopped in his tracks, his eyes filled with gentle light, his voice so obedient it was as if he was a different person. "Yes, I've been good." Chapter 51. The business trip turned out to be more troublesome than Eloise had anticipated. She had expected it to be a 3-day affair, but plans often fall victim to change. The branch office had left behind a number of old accounts, and since last year, there had been irregularities in the financial aspects. However, the initial discrepancies were not significant, so they were not pursued. The latest quarterly financial statements, however, clearly indicated a serious issue. After Eloise informed Axel of this matter, Axel instructed her to go and investigate on site directly. As it was a surprise inspection, the staff at the branch office were caught off guard, and as a result, some problems and loopholes could not be glossed over, exposing themselves. After several days of investigation, Eloise indeed found some leads. In the evening, Eloise returned to the hotel and, after a shower, received a video call from Leonardo. As she pressed the answer button, the man's face appeared on the screen. An oddly deathly angle filled the screen with the man's face, but thanks to his high looks, he was still handsome despite the unflattering angle. The sight was simply too amusing. Eloise raised an eyebrow, feeling an impulse to laugh, but she stoically endured it and sneaked a screenshot. "In your room?" Eloise asked, wiping her wet hair as she walked to the bed and sat down. The man replied softly, his gaze darkening as he spotted something, his voice growing more magnetic as he continued. "How much longer until you're back?" "I should be back in a day or two," Eloise said. "You're lying to me," came the man's voice from the other end of the phone, tinged with a hint of grievance. Although she knew there was a 90% chance the kid was acting again, her heart still softened. Lying about what? As soon as the words left her mouth, the screen on the phone shook, and the man's bare upper body appeared in front of her eyes. The camera zoomed in on his collarbone, and before Eloise could react, the man's voice sounded again. "The mark on me is about to fade, and you still haven't returned." Eloise paused, finally noticing the faint trace on the man's collarbone, and chuckled. "Then why don't you make another one yourself?" As soon as the words left her mouth, the camera angle on the phone changed again, and the man's face reappeared in front of her, but this time, the angle was much more pleasing. The 45-degree angle tilted upwards made the scenery below him somewhat visible, coupled with his oblivious expression. One could not tell if he was unaware or deliberate. She did not know where he had developed this habit, but his clothes were always poorly worn. "No," the man said, pausing for a moment before continuing, "I want you to give it to me." There was a childish stubbornness in his tone that made Eloise smile and shake her head. To be honest, she had not expected Leonardo to take it seriously. The kiss before she left had been a spur-of-the-moment decision, not meant for him to use the mark as a countdown to her return. "Leonardo, aren't you a bit too clingy?" As soon as these words were uttered, the man's expression froze, his eyes instantly becoming much darker. The atmosphere in the room became somewhat strange. The corners of the man's mouth tightened, his face turning pale. Eloise naturally noticed Leonardo's change, but she had no intention of explaining. This was a test, after all. The old Eloise had not noticed anything, but since discovering Leonardo's true nature, she had gradually become aware of the abnormalities. Leonardo's feelings for her were too passionate, even bordering on obsession. Actually, Eloise could understand. People with depression would unconsciously lack a sense of security, which is why they wanted to stay by their partner's side at all times, constantly wanting to do something to increase their sense of security. Eloise was not worried that Leonardo would harm her. Her courage was not that small. No matter what Leonardo wanted to do to her, she was confident she could handle any situation. However, even so, she could not always indulge him, as that was not the way to solve the problem, but rather would lead to an even worse outcome. The sense of security does not only come from the partner, but also from self-affirmation. The term, Taming refers more to skillfully guiding, and what she needed to do was to tentatively probe, step by step, leading him. Do you hate it? The man's voice echoed through the phone, faint, yet concealing a deeper emotion that was hard to grasp but palpable, emanating a faint sense of danger. The woman looked at the man on the phone screen, her cool expression as calm as ever, as if her words had not caused her any distress or confusion. Eloise narrowed her eyes, staring at Leonardo's expression, as if trying to discern something from his countenance. "I don't hate it," the woman said, her tone calm yet harsh, "but Leonardo, you know that my identity doesn't allow me to have a lot of time for myself or for you." Yes, as the eldest daughter of QS Corporation, she was born at the top of the pyramid, possessing power and wealth that many could not even dream of. In exchange, she was occupied by various training courses since childhood, measured by a set of very strict standards, with almost no time of her own. Perhaps this was also the reason why she was so wild after coming of age. She had tried all the romantic escapades, smoking, drinking, racing cars, and all kinds of experiences. At the end of the day, what she wanted to satisfy was not just lust or love, but to rebel against the dull and tasteless life, to seek excitement. However, despite this, she would never do anything to harm the company's interests. Eloise's father also saw this in her, so most of the time, he turned a blind eye to her actions. In his view, her behavior was just a little mischief. The company's interests were the bottom line. As long as she didn't go too far, it was just a minor issue. After all, her time, her life was not entirely her own. Often, it belonged to the company. The burden she carried was not just her own interests, but also those of all shareholders, employees, and even other cooperative enterprises. This was a cruel reality. Eloise had understood this since she was very young, and now she had to make Leonardo understand this as well. In the quiet room, no one spoke. On the phone screen, the man's expression seemed unchanged, his eyes lowered, making it hard to see the emotion in them. Eloise did not notice that, off camera, the man's hand holding the phone was so tense that his fingertips turned white, while his other hand clenched into a fist, nails digging into his palm, as if only pain could maintain his apparent calm. Leonardo. As soon as Eloise spoke, Leonardo finally moved, collapsing onto the bed, the front camera facing the ceiling, his handsome face disappearing from the screen. "I know," the deep voice sounded again, tinged with a hint of helplessness and bitterness, as if sincerely repenting. However, in the empty room with no one else, half of the man's face was buried in the pillow, the other half revealed under the warm yellow light, exuding a chilling aura. His dark pupils were turbulent, bright to the point of alarming, like a demon from hell, stained with blood. His hand gripping the blanket tightened, and the man buried his face deeper into the pillow, inhaling deeply, the lingering fragrance entering his nostrils, suppressing some of the inner restlessness, yet fueling the growing obsession and desire. He knew what kind of person he had fallen in love with. Looking back now, back then, the woman had seemed like a warrior in armor, forging her way through obstacles to reach his side. She had said she would always protect him, and he had believed her. Regardless of whether these words were true or false, he would make them into what he wanted, by any means necessary. Upon hearing the man's voice, Eloise frowned slightly, secretly beginning to doubt whether her words were too harsh. However, this thought lasted only a few seconds before Eloise dismissed it. The kid was the best at acting, and she couldn't be so easily swayed. "Where's your face? You're calling me with a video, but not showing your face." The topic suddenly shifted, and Eloise's tone was tinged with teasing. In the next moment, the man's eyes flashed, and the turbulent emotions in his eyes vanished, returning to their original state. He raised his hand to turn the camera back towards himself, revealing only his face. "Eloise, sometimes I can't control myself," the man said, his long, dense eyelashes fluttering as the phone approached, making Eloise's heart itch. "Leonardo, don't doubt yourself and don't doubt me." Eloise said, staring at the face so close, her throat suddenly tightening. The man was probably lying on his side on the bed, his shoulders slightly raised, and the mole in the collarbone pit occasionally appearing on the phone screen, making Eloise unable to resist. For some reason, she seemed to have a particular fondness for that mole, finding it incredibly sexy. "Be good, okay?" Eloise said, then her mouth curved into a smile as she continued, "Show me the mark again." In the next moment, the man's eyes flickered, and the camera angle shifted slightly downward, his neck stretching out in a suggestive arc, while the faint kiss mark below was once again exposed to Eloise's eyes. It must be said that every part of the man's body was filled with temptation: the beautifully curved neck, the clearly defined collarbones, the Adam's apple rolling slightly, all of it was silently seducing. Eloise narrowed her eyes, her mind recalling the scenes of their passionate encounters. Her little boyfriend always pretended to be weak and helpless in front of her, yet when it came to that aspect of their relationship, he was anything but gentle. The exuberant muscles, the hot breath, the shining eyes, and the sight of sweat trickling down his chest all displayed wildness. "Want it?" After a while, Eloise chuckled, her voice tinged with a hint of temptation. "Then be good, and I'll give it to you when I come back." The man's gaze darkened as he stared at the flickering, obscure light on the ceiling. "Okay, I'll be obedient," he promised. Half a minute later, the video call ended, and the man tossed his phone onto the bed, curling his body slightly as he buried himself into the bedding. During the 15-minute conversation, Eloise on the other end hadn't noticed that the room the man was in was not a guest room. The soft bed was filled with the scent of Eloise, so comforting yet so maddening. The man tightly embraced the woman's blanket, clutching it fiercely to his chest. He lay in the place where the woman usually slept, resting his head on her pillow, turning his head with a deep sense of attachment as he buried his face into the pillow, closing his eyes slightly, and then opening them to reveal a raging desire. He would be very obedient. If he couldn't possess all of her, then he would have to settle for whatever was left. Everything. 2 days later, Eloise arrived at the international airport in City A. As soon as she stepped off the plane, Eloise and Luke rushed straight to the company, their expressions inevitably heavy. Over the span of 5 days, Eloise had thoroughly investigated the situation at the branch. The company's finances had indeed been problematic for quite some time. Last year, the branch president, Nathan, hired a new female assistant who was both well-educated and attractive, with a sweet-talking and considerate nature, and she was quite young. Soon, the two became romantically involved. Since last year, the company's performance had been gradually declining. Nathan, fearing accountability from the headquarters, was anxious for a long time. Later, the female assistant suggested the idea of cooking the books, and Nathan, momentarily bewitched, agreed to her scheme. The company's operations continued to deteriorate, and the two persisted in their collusion, concealing their fraudulent bookkeeping from everyone. However, the company's loopholes kept expanding, and there would come a day when they would be exposed. So, the two conspired to abscond with the funds. Perhaps due to their urgency, their efforts were a bit excessive, and Eloise easily spotted the discrepancies. According to the investigation, Nathan had submitted his resignation to the headquarters a month ago, and the procedures were completed in the past few days. If it hadn't been for Eloise's sudden intervention, Nathan might have succeeded. Upon discovering the fraud, Eloise immediately reported it to the police and then compiled all the investigation reports into a document sent to the headquarters. As for Nathan and the female assistant, a prison sentence was inevitable. The company's legal team was not to be taken lightly, and they did not worry about giving them any chance to escape justice. The key issue was not this. The branch managed by Nathan was involved in the electronic products industry of QS Corporation with an independent brand. It had a fixed business model from technology research and development to the production line. Since last year, the company's product sales had been declining, with a large number of goods piling up in the warehouse. A considerable amount of R&D funding had been invested, but the shipments had not kept up, leading to an ever-increasing loss for the company. After the fraudulent bookkeeping was exposed, the true condition behind the scenes was shocking. If they could not sell off the batch of goods stuck in the warehouse in order to prevent further losses, the headquarters might announce the bankruptcy of the branch. Even so, a significant amount of money was needed to fill the gap. In theory, most of this money should have been paid by Nathan. However, although he was the president of the branch, he was ultimately hired by the headquarters, and his salary was also paid by the headquarters. Despite appearing glamorous in the eyes of outsiders, with his financial situation, filling the company's hole was like using a cup to bail out a boat leaking in a downpour. Back at the company, Eloise headed straight to Axel's office and once again described the situation at the branch from beginning to end. Upon hearing this, Axel's expression turned increasingly serious. In the quiet office, Axel looked at Eloise in front of him and coldly asked, "What are your thoughts?" Eloise fell silent for a moment, unsure whether she should speak her mind. On her return journey, she had initially formed an idea in her mind. By nature, she was not someone who liked to admit defeat. Moreover, the situation had not reached an irreversible point. As long as they could sell off as much of the goods as possible from the warehouse to recover a portion of the company's losses, and then launch a new product line to increase overall sales, they could minimize the company's losses to the greatest extent. Most importantly, once the branch declared bankruptcy, the share price of QS Corporation might plummet, and the resulting losses would be beyond their estimation. The Cold and Game company I mentioned earlier is preparing for a national league. I think we can lower our product prices and collaborate with them on the event to obtain exclusive sponsorship rights, Eloise suggested. The electronic products mainly produced by the branch were some equipment, such as computer hosts, monitors, headphones, mice, and a series of other electronic devices. Because a large amount of research funding had been invested in the early stages, the quality and performance were definitely among the best in the industry. Such configurations were more than suitable for professional league matches. However, due to the high pricing, sales had been lukewarm. In addition, the competition had intensified in the past 2 years, and the company's product promotion had not been sufficient, which led to a large accumulation of goods. Cold and Game. Axel raised an eyebrow, puzzled. Didn't you say that company was short on funds and about to go bankrupt a while ago? It was acquired, and a lot of money was invested afterward. Now, it ranks third in the domestic game download charts and has some visibility, Eloise explained. The original game already had a good reputation. It was just that the company didn't have the money to continue operating. The players didn't know this and were still happily playing the game. Even when the company changed owners, they were unaware. After the acquisition, the new owners spent a lot of money on promotion, and this national tournament was also to take advantage of the momentum to further attract new players. If we are to sponsor, the headquarters will have to continue investing. How can you guarantee that this money won't go down the drain? Axel's tone was particularly sharp, as if he didn't show any leniency because the person standing in front of him was his daughter. All the equipment used in the competition can be from the batch of goods piling up in the warehouse. I've checked, and those devices are still perfectly capable of handling the matches, which also solves the issue of product stagnation. At the same time, we can also leverage the game competition for publicity, and with the subsequent sales following up, it should not be a problem. This was Eloise's idea. She admitted that there was an element of gambling involved, but if they didn't try this, bankruptcy might be the only outcome. Axel remained silent for a moment, his fingers interlocked, resting his hands in front of his mouth, looking at Eloise with no trace of kindness in his eyes. What you need to do is not to convince me, but the other shareholders, Axel said, continuing, 3 days later, the company will hold a shareholders meeting to discuss the disposal of the branch in City H. At that time, it will depend on your own abilities. Upon hearing this, Eloise's expression became solemn. Eloise's father had always been a strict figure in front of Eloise. Instead of helping based on their father-daughter relationship, Eloise's father would completely let go, just like an eagle throwing its child off a cliff to force it to learn to fly. I understand, Eloise replied. Just as she was about to leave, Axel spoke again. Mr. Zhao's shares have been transferred. Eloise's footsteps paused, her eyebrows furrowing as she asked, "What do you mean?" "There have been people buying up the group's scattered shares for some time, which I've heard about. Now, coupled with Mr. Zhao's 5%, that person currently holds 8% of the shares," Axel said, his eyes darkening. 8% was not a small amount. Although it didn't have the influence of other major shareholders, it could play a crucial role in the group's decisions to some extent. "Eloise, have you found out who it is?" "No," Axel replied, his expression stoic, showing no signs of urgency. "But I've had someone send him a notice. The identity of the new shareholder will be revealed at the shareholders' meeting in 3 days." Over the next 3 days, Eloise immersed herself in her busy work again. Leonardo felt somewhat frustrated by this, but he had heard about the situation at the QS Corporation branch, and he was well aware of what would be discussed at the shareholders' meeting in 3 days. Leonardo knew Eloise's intentions. She wanted to save the branch. Once bankruptcy was declared, the company's losses were secondary. All the employees working there would face unemployment. Perhaps for the entire QS Corporation, the survival of the branch was a matter of more or less meat. But for some people, it could be a crucial turning point for the entire family. The 3 days passed quickly. Eloise began to leave early and return late, spending longer hours at the company, and when she returned to the apartment, she would immediately go to the study, staying there until around 11 o'clock. Leonardo watched all this, sometimes standing at the study door, gazing at the woman's serious demeanor as she worked, his eyes inscrutable. 3 days later, the shareholders' meeting arrived as scheduled. A little before 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Eloise arrived at the conference room early to prepare. In 10 minutes, several familiar faces arrived one after another, each wearing a false smile, maintaining a superficial harmony. At 1 o'clock sharp, all members were present on time. Axel sat in the main seat. Just as everyone thought the meeting was about to begin, they heard Axel suddenly say, "Before we start the meeting, let's welcome the new shareholder of the group." As soon as the words fell, everyone turned their gazes to the conference room door. Eloise narrowed her eyes, her heart brimming with anticipation. Under the scrutiny of the crowd, the closed door was opened from the outside. The next moment, a familiar face appeared before Eloise's eyes. It was none other than her dear little boyfriend, Leonardo. Chapter 52. Eloise stared at the man who had suddenly appeared before her, her expression quickly returning to normal, but with a furrowed brow and a somewhat somber complexion. A torrent of tumultuous emotions surged within her, something Eloise had never experienced before. She had said she detested deception, and at this moment, Leonardo's act of concealment had, to some degree, crossed her line. True, usually, no matter how men performed or pretense, she saw it as merely a playful dynamic between lovers, harmless. She wouldn't deliberately expose them, even tolerating their games. But this was different. When it came to company matters, she couldn't just sit idly by. So, it had been him behind the scenes all this time, secretly acquiring shares, then swallowing up Mr. Zhao's 5% of the shares. What exactly was his goal? Eloise truly hadn't expected that her little boyfriend would one day turn against her. Their gazes clashed suddenly over a few meters, a glimmer flashing in the man's eyes. As he was about to speak, he saw the woman turn her head abruptly, her face showing a strong sense of. His expression froze slightly. Leonardo stood rooted in place, the fiery light in his eyes instantly extinguished, replaced by a chilling, unsettling coldness. In the conference room, everyone stared at the man who had suddenly appeared. The atmosphere in the vast space grew slightly strange. His arrival was too sudden. The shareholders present had no prior knowledge, and now, looking at this young man, their shock only grew. How young he was! What's going on? Who is this youngster who suddenly popped up? Surprise aside, the expressions on everyone's faces also grew more serious, sensing that this young man's intentions were not simple. First, let's have a self-introduction. Axel broke the silence as he spoke up. Having already gone through this outside the meeting room, and with years of experience in the business world, Axel appeared more composed than the others. Leonardo, Xia of refusal, Hui of Huaibei. His tone was extremely cold, devoid of any humility, his indifferent expression seeming arrogant to everyone present. "Oh, I didn't expect. Young blood is fearless," someone suddenly chimed in, sounding like praise, but with a hint of sarcasm. "Indeed, who would have thought this new friend is so young? Guess he looks down on us old men, huh?" The once silent conference room suddenly buzzed with activity, a volley of sarcastic remarks seemingly setting out to give the newcomer a hard time. Axel sat in his chair, observing the scene. As the chairman, he remained silent for the moment. His sharp gaze shone as he scrutinized Leonardo, his eyes carrying a hint of examination and inquiry. However, at that moment, Eloise, who had been silent in her chair, suddenly stood up, slamming her documents on the table with a soft thud, causing the chattering crowd to fall silent instinctively. The conference room fell silent once more, all eyes focusing on Eloise, including Axel and Leonardo. "It's about time, Eloise. Shouldn't the meeting start now?" Eloise said, her tone carrying an air of authority. Axel met his daughter's gaze. Through years of familiarity, he immediately sensed she was upset. Puzzled, he still responded with a casual, officially starting the shareholder meeting. The main topic of this meeting was the future of the subsidiary in City H. Eloise aimed to preserve the company and had invested substantial time and effort into planning. Once the meeting began, as the discussions directly impacted their interests, all shareholders' attention shifted back to Eloise. Over 40 minutes, Eloise presented her ideas clearly, including the primary objective of collaborating with Colwyn Game, how to resolve the backlog in the warehouse, and the positioning and reform of the company's post-merger products. Everything she had thought of and could think of, Eloise detailed in her presentation. For a moment, the shareholders were lost in thought, with those initially uninterested slowly forming opinions. Currently, the esports industry was booming, with limitless potential for the future. Simultaneously, esports could drive many industries, one of which was the development and manufacturing of electronic products. I want to point out that while the subsidiary in City H has indeed caused significant losses to the group, it's not beyond redemption. Eloise spoke with a confident, assertive tone. Standing at the center of the podium, she emanated confidence, displaying no traces of stage fright, even when confronted with numerous shareholders. Leonardo's gaze had not left Eloise for a single minute since he entered the conference room. Like a creature lurking in the shadows, desperately craving sunlight, Eloise was too dazzling, giving off an unattainable aura. He indulged in every moment spent with her, wanting to infiltrate her life as much as possible, like vines silently entwining around her limbs. He didn't want her to leave, didn't want to give her a chance to leave. He needed his presence in every aspect of her life, tangled to the point of indistinction, to a degree that could fill the void and longing in his heart. Perhaps this was also why he acquired shares in QS Corporation and stood here. If QS Corporation was so crucial to her, then he wanted to be a part of that crucial. But Eloise seemed to be upset. "What if it doesn't work out?" Someone suddenly objected in the conference room. "Your plan is based on everything going smoothly. If the collaboration with Colwyn Game doesn't meet our expectations, wouldn't our losses be even greater?" Clearly, the scheme had a chance of winning, but also a significant chance of losing. Some preferred not to take the step, fearing further losses. Cutting losses short was what they hoped for. "I've done my research. The game from Colwyn Game is currently ranked third on the game charts, with good reviews and reputation. Moreover, Colwyn Game is increasing its promotional efforts, so there's no issue with visibility," Eloise said, flipping the PPT back to the previous page. "Once we collaborate with Colwyn Game, all equipment in the events can be our company's products. I have confidence in our products, believing that players will experience their superiority in practice." "You're just talking big," someone scoffed from the crowd. Eloise's eyes flashed with a dark light at this, but she showed no sign of displeasure. QS Corporation, as the founder, has always held absolute control over the group. In the past, it was fine, but as QS Corporation grew larger, more people grew envious. Whether in board or shareholder meetings, there were always those who nitpicked, like now. Every statement Eloise made in the meeting was based on extensive research and data analysis. How could it be merely talking big? But some people were like this, raising every doubt and decision in meetings not necessarily for the group's interests, but often to satisfy their own desires. Truly foolish. Let's vote. Those in favor, raise your hands, Axel said, showing no opinion outwardly, yet his hand slowly rose on the table, expressing his stance. Within a minute, a few scattered shareholders gradually raised their hands. Those who had been criticizing saw the situation wasn't looking good and couldn't help but speak up again. How can you be sure Colwyn Game will cooperate with us? What if they require a high sponsorship fee? That subsidiary has already cost us so much money, and now we're investing more. What if it backfires? Hearing this, those who had initially raised their hands began to waver. Eloise frowned, about to speak, when the man who had been silent in the corner suddenly chimed in, "It won't." Instantly, all eyes focused on Leonardo again, including Eloise, who glanced towards him. Finally receiving attention from his beloved, Leonardo's lips curved slightly, meeting Eloise's somewhat cold gaze with intense eyes, speaking again with a wild tone. "I agree with Eloise's partnership." The atmosphere in the conference room took on an eerie twist. Eloise's eyes flashed with confusion, then realization, her eyebrows slightly raised. "What do you mean?" The earlier speaker, with a dark face, looked at Leonardo in his chair, his tone tinged with offended anger. Nevertheless, Leonardo didn't even deign to glance at the person, his gaze steadfastly fixed on Eloise, as if everyone else in the room were mere air, and only Eloise truly existed. "Colwyn Game is currently under my ownership," Leonardo stated, raising his hand slowly, his eyes growing more profound. "I look forward to collaborating with Eloise." The final vote resulted in the approval of Eloise's proposal. As the meeting concluded, the troublemakers left first, their backs radiating with anger. During the dispersal, many still approached Leonardo to extend their goodwill, because it was evident to all in that meeting that this newcomer was not simple. With his age, owning a gaming company and holding an 8% stake in QS Corporation, in a few years, everyone present might have to look up to this young man. Leonardo wasn't fond of making polite talk. This superficial insincerity was quite a waste of time. However, considering it was QS Corporation, and the few individuals approaching were shareholders who had voted in favor of Eloise, he endured it for a moment, responding with a cold expression. Just then, Eloise's voice suddenly rang out, interrupting all attempts at conversation. "Do you have time? Let's discuss the cooperation." At these words, the others' gazes flicked between the two, and then, sensing the situation, they withdrew one by one, leaving only Eloise and Leonardo in the vast conference room. In that instant, the polite smile on Eloise's face vanished, and the air around them chilled suddenly, causing a slight tremor in Leonardo's heart. Before he could speak, the woman turned and left directly, her back clean and decisive. Leonardo stood still for 2 seconds, then hurriedly followed, not daring to speak or get too close, merely maintaining a steady distance of 1 meter. The two entered the elevator one after the other. Although they appeared normal, there was an inexplicable chill down the spine of those in the elevator with them. When they exited, the remaining staff in the elevator exhaled sharply, watching the two leave, feeling a strange sense of a master dragging a misbehaving dog. 5 minutes later, Eloise entered her office, and the man followed in silence. Just as he closed the door and was about to turn around, a gust of wind suddenly flashed before his eyes. Before Leonardo could react, he was unexpectedly pinned against the door panel, a sharp pain on his cheek, and when he looked up again, he met the woman's gaze head-on. His heart skipped a beat. Leonardo slightly bent his knees, maintaining this somewhat strenuous position, not daring to move a muscle. His cheeks were pinched fiercely by the woman with one hand, and he could only tightly press his lips together, trying his best to appear less foolish. "I'm angry regardless," he has to endure it. "I really underestimated you," Eloise said, her expression dark and tinged with a hint of hostility, her eyes gleaming coldly, her grip not easing in the slightest. Leonardo was slightly stunned, then lowered his gaze, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The man's Adam's apple moved up and down, his expression devoid of emotion, slightly mournful, his eyelashes trembling, his voice tinged with a hint of desolation and caution. "Sorry, I didn't expect you to be so angry." Eloise's eyes narrowed, her gaze unwavering, her cold eyes fixed on the man's face. His pitiful appearance, under normal circumstances, she might have actually been deceived by him. But she had been fooled before, and now she would not fall into the same trap twice. Moreover, to acquire Colwyn Game and an 8% stake in QS Corporation in such a short time, and to still believe he was just a pitiful and weak boyfriend, that would be dreaming. "What exactly do you want?" Eloise said, increasing the pressure of her grip. The man was forced to slightly lift his chin, meeting Eloise's gaze. The atmosphere in the office became extremely tense, the distance between the two no more than a punch, the woman's leg wedged between the man's feet, in an absolutely dominant position. Leonardo's back was pressed against the door panel, his semi-squatting posture allowing their gazes to meet on equal terms. With a slightly desolate expression, a slightly pale complexion, appearing as if he was fully submissive, yet Eloise knew that beneath this highly deceptive disguise lurked a beast with sharp fangs, and one slight misstep could result in being devoured without a trace. "Eloise, I mean no harm, I just want to be closer to you," Leonardo said, his words tinged with the disappointment of being misunderstood. In the next moment, a cold laugh came, laced with a hint of sarcasm, echoing in the vast office. Leonardo's eyes darkened. Just as he was about to say something to deceive, he saw Eloise suddenly take out her phone from her pocket, swiftly tapping on the screen a few times, and then a familiar voice entered Leonardo's ears. "Just a mediocre piece of trash. Retreating in order to advance, understand? Trying to play mind games with me? You're still too young." The two stared at each other, the quiet office filled with the audio playing from the phone, and the man's pupils contracted sharply the moment he heard the voice, gradually sinking as the progress bar advanced, until finally, his almost ink-like pupils resembled the night sea, inscrutable and filled with endless danger, sending shivers down one's spine. The recording ended, and Eloise waved her phone in front of Leonardo, her voice carrying a hint of threat. "Leonardo, what are you still pretending here for? Acting addicted, are you?" The man's eyes flashed with a dark light, and in the next instant, the obedient man suddenly made a move, quickly grabbing the woman's shoulder. The situation instantly reversed, and the one who was originally pinned down managed to flip the tables, pressing the person against the door, leaning in, his voice low and dangerous. "Honey, are you sure?" His magnetic voice line, his lips brushing against her earlobe, his hot breath constantly spraying into her ear canal, sexy to the extreme, more like seduction. Eloise's gaze darkened a bit, her lips slightly pursed, her cold demeanor undiminished. The man firmly imprisoned her in his arms, his hands on the door panel, leaving her no chance to escape. At this moment, Eloise felt an unprecedented pressure and invasion, like a surging tide, almost overwhelming her. If it were someone else, they might be scared to the point of paling. But Eloise has never been just someone else. Her back remained straight, not trying to escape, not struggling, allowing the beast to pace around her, yet showing no signs of panic. "Eloise, do you know how much I want to lock you in a room? In a room with only the two of us, where your eyes can only see me," the man said, his nose lightly brushing against the woman's cheek, following the jawline, resting on her neck. Speaking, his cold lips lightly stroked the fair skin, causing Eloise to frown involuntarily. "Eloise, you don't understand how much I love you so much that I want to tie you to my side. You don't know how hard I've been enduring. Highly dangerous remarks, even carrying a hint of faint abnormality. This is the man without any disguise, gloomy, sensitive, and extreme. So, do you dare? Eloise asked, unfazed. As soon as the words fell, the man's body trembled slightly, and the next moment he straightened up, meeting the woman's gaze. She was still the same, despite her current situation, still so calm and composed. The fear, disgust, and other emotions he imagined did not appear in Eloise's eyes, allowing Leonardo's restless heart to gradually calm down. "Of course I don't dare," the man said, tugging at the corners of his mouth. She was clearly in a weak position, yet still maintained a dominant stance. In this relationship, she seemed to have always been the winner. "How could I dare? I'm terrified of seeing you hate me, terrified of you treating me with the indifference of a passerby," Leonardo said, his expressionless face matched with his casual tone, as if mentioning it offhand, but it caused Eloise's gaze to pause slightly. The man's gaze on Eloise was still so fervent, scorching her heart. "Eloise, when you provoked me back then, you didn't expect I was a madman, did you?" His voice carried a hint of desolation. Eloise's throat tightened, and the next moment, her gaze darkened. She grabbed the man's tie and pulled it down forcefully. Their faces closed in an instant, so sudden that the man's pupil shook, looking into the woman's eyes, unable to come to his senses for a long time. "I don't care if you're mad or not. If you dare to touch the company, I'll still teach you a lesson, family or not." The woman's tone carried a hint of coldness and ruthlessness. However, Leonardo's attention was inexplicably focused on the word family. His gaze flickered, and the next moment, the man's brows softened, and even his eyes flashed with a strange sense of joy. "How could I? I love you so much. How could I do anything to make you dislike me?" the man said, his body subconsciously leaning towards the woman, willingly being pulled by the tie, willingly bowing his head to her. "I'm just jealous. Jealous that your heart has other things, jealous that I haven't owned all of you." At some point, the originally tense atmosphere gradually changed direction. Strands of ambiguity and heat spread in the air, entwining around the two. "That's the price you pay for falling in love with me," Eloise declared with an air of unshakable certainty that came across as arrogantly confident. "I love you, so I'm willing to endure all your paranoia and madness. You love me, and you must accept that I won't be entirely yours. That's how love works, Leonardo, understand?" From the outset, Leonardo's gaze had been locked onto Eloise's eyes, deeply ensnared and never straying away. Upon hearing the words, "I love you," a tidal wave of emotion surged forth, shattering all his rational defenses. His eyes darkened, and in the next moment, he passionately sealed his lips over hers. The fervent kiss was a standoff with no intention of retreat, more of a contest where neither would concede. Leonardo voraciously took her breath away, as if only in this way could he solace his deranged emotions, while Eloise did not reject him, her every move tinged with a subtle act of revenge. This kiss wasn't just a kiss, it was a battle between the two of them. They had no retreat, neither could easily extricate themselves from this relationship. On the surface, it might seem fraught with inequality, a one-sided infatuation, but in truth, who could escape so easily? After an unknown duration, the war without gunfire finally came to an end. Leonardo leaned against her forehead, breathing heavily, his voice husky as he replied, "I understand. As long as you keep loving me, I'll always behave myself." If this is the price, then he was willing to pay it. In the intertwining of pain and joy, he was willing to remain delusional his entire life, sinking down together with her. Moments later, the woman pushed away the man leaning over her, the flush from the kiss gradually fading, returning her to her initial composure. Eloise looked at Leonardo's disheveled collar and his thin lips smeared with lipstick. Her eyes dimmed, and her voice took on a cool, elegant tone. "Now, it's time to discuss serious matters." Her crimson lips curved, her eyes gleaming with a flickering light. Chapter 53. Over the course of half an hour, Eloise and Leonardo roughly discussed their collaboration on the gaming competition. In such moments, Eloise is the most public-private dichotomous. She can passionately kiss the person in front of her 1 second, and the next, discuss cooperation as if nothing had happened. Leonardo, of course, knows Eloise's character, so when discussing the collaboration, he only regarded himself as a representative of Coldwind Game. Otherwise, he might have provoked Eloise's anger. However, despite the man's seemingly serious demeanor, his thoughts beneath the chill were quite fiery. The woman's stern and focused expression only served to excite him strangely, especially when she addressed him as Sir, which inevitably stirred his soul. The woman before him was so proud and flamboyant, and not long ago, she had pulled on his tie to declare her love for him and had ardently responded to his kiss. Eloise is always like this, bewitching like a demon, driving him crazy with every move, and yet, she can quickly regain her composure and extricate herself completely once it's over. But even so, he remains infatuated with her. After an unknown period, when the main aspects were almost discussed, Eloise finally stood up from the couch. Leonardo, sitting opposite, also stood up subconsciously, about to say something when he heard Eloise say, "That's it for today. Take care and don't let the door hit you on the way out." Leonardo was slightly taken aback, his gaze heavy as he looked at the woman in front of him, his tone seemingly indifferent, but with a hint of grievance. "You're not going to see me out?" Hearing this, Eloise raised an eyebrow, her tone particularly cold. "I have things to attend to. See yourself out." Leonardo pursed his lips, his eyes darkening, and then he said, "I am, after all, the new shareholder of the group. If I walk out alone, what if those gossipy people see me?" With that, the man added, "I don't mean anything else, just thinking for your sake." Upon hearing this, Eloise's gaze paused, and after a moment, she smiled, walking towards Leonardo. Watching the approaching figure of the woman, the man couldn't help but feel nervous, his Adam's apple moving up and down, his heart rate involuntarily accelerating as he met her bright and captivating eyes. The next moment, his lips were harshly pressed, watching the woman reach out and wipe his lips with her fingertips, then chuckled, "You're something else." As soon as the words fell, the woman suddenly withdrew her hand and walked past the man towards the direction of the office door. Watching Eloise's departing back, Leonardo's eyes darkened, imitating the woman's previous action, lowering his head to see the splash of crimson on his fingertips. It was left by Eloise from their kiss earlier. The corners of his mouth curved slightly, but in an instant, he returned to his original state, following Eloise towards the door of the office. The two walked out of the office, only to bump into Axel, who had come to find Eloise. The unexpected encounter left the three of them momentarily awkward. "What's going on?" Axel's puzzled gaze swept between the two, finally settling on Leonardo's face, narrowing his eyes, feeling that this new shareholder seemed familiar. Discussing the collaboration matters, Leonardo said before Eloise could speak. Contrary to his demeanor in the conference room, the man now wore a warm and polite smile, extending his hand to Axel with a tone that was neither humble nor overbearing, but also conveyed a hint of goodwill. "I didn't get the chance to greet you properly before the meeting. That was my discourtesy." Axel scrutinized Leonardo, his sharp gaze secretly examining the man from head to toe, and after a moment, a faint smile appeared on his face as he shook Leonardo's hand, saying, "Pleased to meet you." In that moment, the smile in Leonardo's eyes deepened, devoid of the arrogance he displayed during meetings. Indeed, Leonardo seemed more humble, showing the modesty of a junior. On the contrary, Eloise is the role model for our juniors. "I've heard our teachers at school mention you before, and meeting you today is a blessing for us juniors." Hearing this, Axel's naturally stern features softened slightly, his tone taking on a bit of interest. "Oh? I wonder which school you graduated from." "I graduated from the finance department at a university." "A university? That's quite coincidental. I've given several speeches there before." "Yes, every time I listen to Eloise's speech, I always feel greatly benefited." Eloise stood coldly to the side, watching Leonardo's covert flattery, while Axel, whom she remembered as always serious and rigid, now seemed unaware of Leonardo's intentions, his brow showing a hint of pleasure. After an unknown period, it was Eloise who finally couldn't stand it anymore, asking, "Axel, did you come to find me for something?" Hearing this, Axel turned his attention to Eloise, then coughed lightly, as if wanting to regain some of his composure from before. "Cough, yes, there's something," Axel said, and then seemed to realize something, adding, "I'll wait for you in your office." With that, the two men exchanged farewells once again, and Leonardo followed Eloise towards the elevator. Inside the sealed elevator, the two stood in the center. The atmosphere became slightly awkward. Time seemed to have stopped at this moment, with only the numbers on the display screen continuing to jump. "What time will you be back tonight?" It was the man who finally broke the silence. "I'll be staying at my parents' house for this period." As soon as these words were spoken, the air in the elevator seemed to drop several degrees. Leonardo's expression darkened, his brow shrouded in gloom, while Eloise, looking at the reflection in the elevator wall, took in all the changes in the man's emotions. "What do you mean by that?" Leonardo said, a heavy darkness in his eyes, his voice cold to the bone. "You're moving out?" As soon as the words were out, Leonardo realized his tone was rather harsh, so he couldn't help but step forward, wrapping Eloise in his arms from behind, his arm across the woman's shoulders, his tone pleading as he said again, "Are you still angry?" Eloise raised an eyebrow, indifferent to the man's almost coquettish behavior, standing still with a hint of cruelty. "You already know." Leonardo didn't expect Eloise to answer so directly, stunned for a moment. Then a mix of laughter and helplessness emerged. It used to be that Eloise wouldn't treat him this way, always indulging and coaxing, but he didn't know when it started. She began to become so cold, and yet he adored it. "Is this a punishment?" the man said, turning his head to peck lightly on the woman's fair neck. Eloise's eyes flickered, and after a moment, she hummed in agreement. "Then when will you come back?" Leonardo said, not resisting, for he knew that once the woman made up her mind, no amount of persuasion would make a difference. Instead of being unknowing of the situation and questioning, it was wiser to yield at the right time. Although his disguise had already been seen through by the woman, it also showed that the tricks he had used before had been effective. Retreat in order to advance. The same principle still applies. "Depends on your behavior," Eloise said, her gaze fixed on the constantly decreasing display screen, and then she spoke sternly once more, "Let go." However, upon hearing Eloise's words, the man showed no intention of complying. The numbers on the elevator screen continued to decrease, while the man's lips lingered on the woman's neck. Eloise narrowed her eyes, unable to understand why the man who used to be flustered and angry after a single kiss in the fitting room had now become so brazen. Indeed, after his sheep's clothing was stripped away, he no longer had the need to pretend. The numbers on the display screen returned to 1, and at that moment, the woman suddenly acted, yanking the man's tie and, before Leonardo could react, biting his lower lip fiercely. Ding! The elevator doors were about to open, and the man's heart was instantly raised to his throat. This scene that should have been under his control had suddenly been reversed by the woman, and his previous defenses were shattered. As the elevator doors began to part, the woman suddenly released the man's collar, pushing his chest forcefully, causing him to stagger back a few steps inadvertently. The distance between the two was instantly pulled apart by half a meter. A series of actions flowed smoothly, and by the time Leonardo reacted, the woman had already turned back, her calm profile looking as if nothing had happened. The heart raced uncontrollably. The man's expression was tense, his lips pressed, his movements unhurried as he straightened his tie. Beneath this seemingly carefree surface, an almost uncontainable madness was brewing. Eloise nodded coolly to the staff at the door, and then said, "Sir, I'll see you off here." Leonardo, who had just straightened his tie, paused, his voice tinged with a hint of hoarseness he hadn't expected, Thank you for your trouble, Eloise. After saying that, Leonardo stepped out of the elevator, and after a few steps, he couldn't resist the impulse within him and turned to look at Eloise, only to meet her eyes, which held a hint of amusement. For a moment, his thoughts became chaotic again. The elevator doors closed, and Eloise's face disappeared from sight, but her gaze seemed to have imprinted itself in the man's heart, lingering and refusing to dissipate. Leonardo suddenly realized that all the cocktails he had ever mixed were not as fiery as Eloise's slightest bit. When Eloise returned to the office, Axel was sitting on the sofa where Leonardo had just been. Upon seeing the newcomer, Axel's expression softened slightly and he asked, "Finished the drop-off?" Eloise replied indifferently, her mind recalling the scene in the elevator. "The one you were saying you were dating? That's him, right?" Axel asked, his tone extremely calm, which made Eloise pause slightly. There was no need to deny it, so after a moment, the woman nodded in acknowledgement. Axel's eyes flickered with understanding, and the corner of his mouth couldn't help but curve up as he continued, no wonder the kid came in with flattery. So that's the plan he's playing. At this point, Eloise glanced at her father expressionlessly, but silently criticized in her heart. Wasn't the flattery quite to the taste? Why is he starting to pretend to be profound again? The young man looks good, presentable, and capable of reaching QS Corporation, which means he's no ordinary person, Axel said, a hint of satisfaction flashing across his face. Then, as if thinking of something else, he frowned and asked, "How old is he?" 24. That's a bit too young, Axel said, his previous satisfaction greatly reduced. A year younger than you. Eloise naturally knew what her father was concerned about, mainly thinking that younger men might not be mature enough in their mindset. After all, at 24, just out of college, they might still be in the age of chasing after girls recklessly. Although Leonardo did seem more mature and outstanding than his peers, who could guarantee that he would be the same when it came to emotions? The woman's gaze darkened, but she had no intention of starting to explain. After all, Leonardo's identity was special, and his past experiences had shaped him into what he was now. If she really wanted to explain something, it would involve much more than a little. Besides, talking about matters of the heart with outsiders was meaningless, even if the other party was her parents. Most importantly, Leonardo's past was not something she should explain. After all, she didn't need to use the method of soliciting sympathy to get her family's approval for her relationship with Leonardo. Even if there was a need for mutual understanding in the future, that should be something Leonardo explains himself. Well, as long as you don't treat it like a game like before, Axel said, as if not intending to dwell on it further. After all, there's still a long way to go. By saying this, Axel subconsciously felt that Eloise's relationship with the young fellow wouldn't last long. First of all, although the kid was outstanding, his age was indeed a bit young, and he might lack a sense of responsibility when it came to love. And he knew very well what kind of person his daughter was, perhaps just dating the kid because of his looks. Regardless, at least the kid was better than those mediocre little stars Eloise had dated before. "By the way, you're coming with me to your parents' house today," Axel said, giving an order in a commanding tone, yet with a hint of concern. "You should know that your mother went for a routine checkup at the hospital a few days ago, and the results weren't great. She's always doted on you the most, so you should go home more often these days to make your mother happy." Hearing this, Eloise's expression couldn't help but grow up a bit. Niev had always had some heart issues and would go to a private hospital for routine checkups from time to time, taking expensive medication to regulate her health. The previous checkup results had always been good, but perhaps with age, her recent condition was not as satisfactory. Eloise had received a call from the attending doctor a couple of days ago and learned about the situation. She had planned to rush back to her parents' house after the shareholder meeting at the branch office. Today's unexpected turn of events provided her with an opportunity to go back to her parents' home and spend more time with Niev. "I'll stay at my parents' house these 2 days," Eloise said. Axel was slightly taken aback by this, then his face showed a hint of relief as he nodded. "That's good. Your mother will definitely be happy to hear that. As for the matter with Leonardo, I'll hold off on telling her. Your mother tends to get nervous, so it's more important to focus on her health right now. Understood. After work in the evening, in the underground parking lot, Eloise sat in the driver's seat of her car. In the silent car, the woman appeared to be deep in thought. Then, after a while, she took out her phone and dialed a number. Within 10 seconds, the call was answered, and without waiting for the other party to speak, Eloise asked directly, "When did Leonardo resign?" The other party paused for a few seconds, then chuckled, replying, "About a month ago." "I can't remember exactly." "What?" "Got bitten by your own pet." Hearing this, Eloise narrowed her eyes, her voice turning colder. "Jim, do you have a loose tongue? He and I are dating. What do you take it for?" Yes, it was just a joke." Knowing he had crossed Eloise's line, Jim on the other end of the phone quickly apologized, his tone showing a bit of helplessness. "I just wanted to remind you, that kid is really not simple. Be careful not to get devoured by him down to the last bone." She now understood that Leonardo was not a simple person. He was much more dangerous than she had imagined. But it was precisely because of this that he was more fascinating than any of her previous boyfriends. Without saying more, Eloise hung up the phone, but then took out a cigarette from the car's storage compartment, lit it, and began to smoke slowly. The stimulation Leonardo had brought her during the afternoon's shareholder meeting still hadn't dissipated. In fact, now that she thought about it, Leonardo had brought her too many surprises and delights. She had thought that her life was dull, which was why she had pursued so-called happiness so recklessly before. But now, looking back, the excitement brought by those little things she did paled in comparison to the intensity brought by Leonardo. Staying at her parents' house was mainly for spending time with Niev, and secondarily for self-restraint. Judging from today's incident, she should have been angry, as Leonardo had reached into QS Corporation without her knowledge. Indeed, as Jim said, it was like being bitten by a child who had been pretending to be good. But in reality, her tolerance for Leonardo exceeded her own imagination. She knew very well that Leonardo's attachment to her was gradually heading towards a twisted direction, and she was supposed to correct him. Yet, she inexplicably began to indulge his behavior, allowing him to slowly devour her. This was naturally wrong, and she had to be ruthless in disciplining him. Not just for him, but also for herself. A few minutes later, the cigarette burned out, and Eloise finally started the car and headed towards her parents' home. As expected, Niev's face lit up with joy when she learned that her daughter would be staying at her parents' house for a while, immediately instructing the butler to clean Eloise's room again, preparing to go all out. Eloise was torn between laughter and tears, persuading Niev for a long time before finally stopping her actions. After dinner in the family dining room, Eloise accompanied her mother for a while, reminded her of some health-related matters, causing Niev to grumble verbally but her eyes to glisten with tears. By 9 o'clock in the evening, Niev, due to her weak health, needed to rest early, and Eloise returned to her bedroom to wash up. However, on the other side, the man alone in the apartment stood in the bathroom, expressionlessly pouring the medicine in the bottle into the toilet, then calmly pressing the flush button. A rush of water sounded in the quiet bathroom, and the man stood there expressionlessly, watching the medicine disappear before his eyes. His lifeless eyes finally showed some movement. Half an hour later, Eloise came out of the bathroom, picked up her phone, and opened the messages, seeing 2 messages from Leonardo, a sentence, and a photo of an empty bottle. Leonardo, image. Leonardo, I've finished the medicine.